Fantastic. Welcome everyone. Super nice to have a Stockholm seminar, and especially given who is here. So we are extremely delighted to have Jane Lubchenco with us. You've been in this room many times before, actually. Back in the early days, you were giving courses here for PhD students, and then we've been having a lot of Stockholm seminars, and also we had one of the first meetings of CBOS in this room also, when we really made big things. It's fantastic to have Jane here. Jane is professor at Oregon State University and also working now, which we want to hear a lot about today. Not just talking about what science can do. Back in '98, I think it was, you wrote a paper that has influenced the world a lot, that's called A New Social Contract for Science. So this really shows that you were serious, because what you're going to talk about today is your amazing work that you've been doing, especially now in the White House, but also earlier on with the Obama administration. So it's a fantastic pleasure for us to have you here. Warmly welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are inside on a day that is spectacularly beautiful outside, so I'm especially appreciative that you are all here. I have great admiration for the work that all of you do, and I'm here to share some of what we have been doing. It looks to me like most of the folks in this room are scientists and researchers. Are there any students in the room? Yes, okay, good. Few but mighty, right? And various other folks that are really interested in the science policy interface, which is what I'm really talking about. Oh, good idea. So we won't hear all of your messages. So what I would like to focus on today is what we are doing so I'm a scientist. I have been an academic for most of my career. I'm currently on loan from my university to serve in the White House as the Deputy Director for Climate and Environment. And I want to share with you a little bit about what we have been doing to bring science into the policy world, to actually make and then implement policies. And part of my focus here is the importance of not just generating scientific knowledge, not just giving it to policymakers in a form that you think might be useful, but giving it to them in a form that they can actually use, and then having scientists in government help advise policymakers and then translate that science into policy and action. And I want to focus on, in particular, the holistic approaches of de-siloing, I would call it, some of the major challenges that the world is faced with today. So let's dive in. I don't have to tell all of you the extent to which the world is confronted by three major social environmental challenges. Each of these, climate change, loss of biodiversity and nature, and inequity and inequality, each of those has its own constituents. Each of them has its own scientific community. Each of them has its own policy community. Much of our approach to each of these issues is currently siloed. There's a convention for climate change. There's a convention for biodiversity. There are some cross-fertilizations. The group of scientists that does international scientific assessments of biodiversity, IPBES, collaborated with the scientists that are working on international scientific assessments through the IPCC to do a joint report. So there are examples of bringing these fields together, but for the most part, they are treated separately, both in much of the scientific world, but especially in the policy world. There are, so the way people think about these issues and the way that policymakers and managers deal with them is very much siloed. Those of you who are scientists that think holistically, think about Earth systems, think about coupled human natural systems, know full well that in fact these are intimately interrelated, and that we really won't be able to solve any of them unless we solve them together collectively with holistic approaches. So the challenge is, how do we translate that scientific knowledge into the kind of policies that also do this kind of integration? So that's the challenge that we are faced with. And that's not only scientists in government, it's all of you. Because as scientists who might be producing knowledge, whom you would like policymakers to use, thinking about that integration and helping finding the policy levers that would be appropriate for that integration is a very significant challenge. And I can't emphasize enough how the extent to which it's not enough to simply present policymakers with information. Here's the latest science on something. And they might be compelled and taken by it and appreciate how important it is, but that doesn't tell them what to do. And so it's not just knowing, it's what do they do about it? And that has to be crafted in the context of what policy levers they have, depending on the positions that they have, what opportunities there are to either move legislation or create policies if they're in the executive branch, for example. So thinking about what opportunities they have and what the policy actions are is critically important. And too few scientists think about those kinds of things. So what we are doing within the Biden-Harris administration is really trying to use the opportunities that we have to do some of this integration. To do that, we have to think about, okay, what are the policy levers we have? What are the tools we have? And one question that I think is worth thinking about is, how does science make it into policy? Well, in some governments, there are directives to base policy on science. That might be an intention, it might be an assumption, or it might be very explicit. When President Obama took office in 2009, for the first time, he actually issued a memorandum that said to all of the people in the executive branch, we're going to base our decisions on science. Later, there was a law that was passed in the United States that requires policy decisions to be based on science, called the Evidence Act. So those are examples of some of the directives. Apart from that, though, it's the people who actually are making the policy that have to implement that. And so I want to focus on policymakers who listen to scientists, and you can identify who those are. And if they aren't listening to science, then create opportunities to share it with them. There are also scientists in government positions, either in the executive branch or a legislative branch or even judicial branches. Not very many of them, but there are scientists there. And this is, as a side note, a plea, especially to the younger folks in the audience, but also to more senior folks, to think about actually spending time in government to the extent that that's possible, either as a fellowship, an intern, or running for office. There are too few policymakers who are scientists, and we need more. So that's not going to be a good fit for many of you. And in fact, I never expected to be doing this. I thought I would be an academic all my life. But when President Obama asked me to come please lead a federal agency for his first term, which was NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, I said yes. And then now here I am back in the White House with President Biden. So there are scientists in positions to actually help make that connection between science and policy. There are also scientists outside of government that work with government officials, and that's more likely to be many of you. And to the extent that you don't do that, please think about it. Find the kind of pathways. There's sometimes very important intermediaries that can help. There are folks whose world is policy, who aren't in government, that understand the policy levers, understand the positions of different politicians, understand what they value, understand what their constituents want, and can help be good brokers of scientific information to the policymakers. So consider using boundary people or boundary organizations. Much of the information that is actually conveyed to these people has to be what I would call policy usable. Now, that's not a term that you will often hear. I think I just created it because I couldn't think of something better. But it's not enough to have policy relevant science, which is what a lot of you probably do. Relevant to policy doesn't mean that policymaker can use it. It has to be information that actually is relevant to a particular policy lever, and that is something that it fits the moment in terms of what the opportunity is, whether it's for legislation or some kind of executive action. So this is all sort of contextual information for you to think about should you be interested in this science policy interface. Again, simply saying to policymakers, whoa, look at how bad the climate situation is. Look at how much we're losing biodiversity. Look at what a horrible state, how much inequity is in the world. That isn't what they need. What they need is, what should they do about it? And so, yes, it is important to say we have a problem, but scaring people doesn't translate into action unless you can tell them what to do about it. And that what to do needs to be more granular than fix land use change or reduce emissions. While those are true, it's not sufficiently granular to actually be folding into most kinds of policy decisions. So I currently serve as Deputy Director for Climate and Environment within the Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's one of many offices in the Executive Office of the President. And we have an opportunity. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy is specifically supposed to bring science for policy, what we've been talking about, but also policy for science. What are the policies that we need to get the science that we need? And so we do both of those. I focus on climate and environment. I have a team of about 25 people who work with me. About half of them are from federal agencies who are on detail from EPA or NOAA or Department of Energy or Department of Interior or NASA or whatever to come serve in the White House for a period of time. The other half are from universities like myself who are on loan to the White House for a specific period of time. So it's a combination of both of those. Many of them are natural and social scientists. We have a lot more social scientists at OSTP than we have in the past. I think that's really important. I've had 3 stellar economists in the position of chief environmental economist for OSTP, which we'd never had before. So bringing both economists and other social scientists into government, I believe, is critically important to good policy. But we also have policy and law experts who are on our team. We partner with other teams within the Office of Science and Technology Policy. There's a tech team, there's a clean energy team, there's a health team, there's a national security team, et cetera, and other offices within the White House. So this is giving you context so that you can make sense of what I'm talking about later. So those other offices within the White House might include the Council on Environmental Quality, or the National Security Council, or the Council of Economic Advisors, or the Office of Management and Budget. So each of those different offices within the Executive Office of the President help craft policies for the administration, for the President, for the administration more broadly, and we coordinate activities across all of the different federal agencies. Much of the actual work, though, is done by the agencies. Those are the ones that have the budgets to actually implement the policies. So they're key partners in all of this. So that's just US context for those of you that might not be intimately familiar. So what we do is focus on sort of three interconnected parallel tracks. One is to make better use of existing scientific knowledge, and that's what I'm focusing on today. You would not believe how many policies in the world are not based on current science. They're often based on outdated science. And there's a huge opportunity out there to modernize our policies and align them with scientific knowledge. So that is a huge, huge opportunity. Far too often, scientists in government are focusing on how can we, what are the big advances for scientific knowledge, either basic discoveries, things that we don't know where they're going to lead, and we might find something that's really important, or use-inspired science in Donald Stokes's language. Donald Stokes was the one who framed Pasteur's quadrant, and he talks about use-inspired science, which is not applied science. It's the science that makes fundamental advances, but is also immediately relevant to societal decisions. So those three tracks are what we focus on. Today, I'm going to be talking about the first one, primarily. How can we actually make better use of scientific knowledge? And specifically, how do we align scientific knowledge about the integration of these three global crises with the policies of those crises? And the way that we have gone about it is you can't just have one policy that covers everything. That's just not realistic. You have climate policies, you have nature policies, you have environmental justice policies. But our approach has been to integrate nature and EJ into climate, to integrate climate and EJ into nature, and to integrate climate and nature into EJ. So that's what I'm going to talk about and give you a little sense of how we've done that and what it looks like. So let's start with the first one. You may have heard about President Biden's historic climate, very ambitious, bold agenda and commitments from day one, focused not only on tackling the climate crisis, but simultaneously boosting the economy and creating jobs. And the fact that we can think about and talk about and pledge to do that is in fact grounded in science. We used to think tackling climate would be a drain on the economy. Thanks to Nick Stern's report and many other things since then, we know that actually they are aligned. And what the president said in announcing this is exactly spot on. We can do both. You can boost the economy, you can create jobs. And so his commitments, you see on the left-hand side, some big, bold commitments to really do so much more than is ever done before. The way that those commitments are actually being made real is through legislation that was passed. Two laws in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, have provided the resources to make some very, very significant commitments that are translating into very tangible outcomes. So this big, bold commitment is being followed by big, bold action, and it's actually really exciting. Is it enough? No, it's nowhere near enough, but it is an amazing start. And the successes that we are seeing give us and others confidence that we can do more. Now, yes, we have to deal with the politics. Yes, we have to have enough agreement that this is working and we want to do more. That's a huge challenge. But the fact that this is underway and is going to continue to deliver benefits for years and years and years to come, both in terms of emissions reductions, but also in terms of economic benefit. And the fact that the federal investments, and in this case, $390 billion, that's an incredible amount, that is now going to these new investments. And that has attracted billions of dollars in private investment. And so it's both federal government investment and private investment that is working together now to achieve some of these big, bold outcomes. So that's kind of the big picture for the climate policy. I want to dig in a little bit more and focus on the nature and the EJ components of that to get back to my theme. So I'm going to give you 5 different examples of things that we have done to do this embedding of nature and EJ in the climate policies. One is to consider not just mitigation, which is what most people focus on when they think about climate policy, reduce emissions, mitigation. That absolutely is ground zero. That's what we need to do, even more, even faster, and in a sustained way. But we also we need to think about adaptation. We no longer have the luxury of focusing only on mitigation because climate change is here. People are suffering all sorts of extreme events. We need to be spending attention and time on adaptation. There are many scientists who don't want to talk about adaptation still. They only want to focus on mitigation because they are concerned if you pivot to adaptation, then we won't be able to get the emission reductions that we need from adaptation. That, I think, is absolutely not true. This is a both and. It's not an either or situation. We need both emissions reduction and attention to adaptation. So we have a national climate resilience framework that kind of lays out what the big picture is, how we're going to think about this. We have resources in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. In this case, for example, $50 billion for coastal resilience. So that's a lot of EJ and a lot of nature in that coastal resilience. There are a lot of nature-based solutions that are embedded in that. And we have something called the Justice 40 Initiative, which says that across all of the money that is spent on climate change, 40% of it, 40% will go to the benefits will go to the disadvantaged communities. So that's a value commitment to embed EJ in all of the climate policies. We've made significant headway with all of these. We're still working on better ways to address extreme heat, which is one of the biggest challenges that still faces many, many communities, and also making food systems on land and in the ocean more climate ready. Both of those are still works in progress. The second way that we're embedding EJ in nature and climate policy is to think about both emission reduction, but also carbon removal. Even if we did as much emission reduction as is technically feasible, we wouldn't be able to meet the climate targets. We have to be thinking about removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that means either removing carbon from the atmosphere or removing it from the ocean, which is in equilibrium with the atmosphere. And that would then take it out of the atmosphere. So carbon removal, carbon dioxide removal is critically important to be thinking about. And that's an arena where we need more scientific knowledge to know how to do it effectively, responsibly, equitably, and in a way that is sustained and doesn't have a lot of other knock-on consequences in terms of environmental impacts. We've had a big focus, so emission reduction and carbon removal. Also, thinking about not just technology, which is what most people think about when they think climate solutions, is tech, tech, tech. Maybe not for you guys, but for others. And so we've made a big pitch for why nature is critically important in this as well, both in terms of the natural carbon dioxide absorption that nature does, but also using that and protecting those habitats like coastal mangroves, salt marshes, seagrass beds that absorb a huge amount of carbon but are disappearing like crazy around the world. So protecting those kinds of areas, but also as people are implementing solutions that will make communities more resilient, using nature-based solutions instead of technology to do that. Using coastal instead of building seawalls using salt marshes, for example, and other examples. So nature-based solutions roadmap was an initial analysis that we did that said, what are the current impediments to using nature-based solutions? It turned out there were a lot of them. They were not the default. A lot of people didn't know about them. Federal agencies have to do a cost-benefit analysis on everything they did, and nature was absent from the cost-benefit analysis. And so, of course, the cost-benefit analysis always said, do the tech solution. There were other impediments. There wasn't money for it. The people weren't trained to do it. If you want to do infrastructure, to build gray infrastructure, it's easy to know how to do that. You just can hire consulting companies and engineering firms and say, oh yeah, we know how to do that. If you want to do nature-based solutions, that's a lot harder. And so we actually mapped out what are the impediments, and we've been systematically removing those impediments to use of nature-based solutions. One of which is, for example, new rules for calculating benefit cost analysis. So federal agencies are now required to include ecosystem services in benefit cost analysis. And the Office of Management and Budget has provided guidance as to how to value ecosystem services in that cost benefit analysis. So that's just one example of how we've been systematically removing those impediments. The IRA and bill legislation includes money for this. And so not only are the rules, but the resources we're mobilizing. The fourth example that I want to give you is thinking about not just solutions on land, but solutions in the ocean. And we're terrestrial, so we think about the land. The ocean is equally important. We know from some scientific analyses that the ocean could deliver as much as 20% of the carbon emission reductions we need to get us to the Paris targets by 2050. But for the most part, ocean has been out of sight, out of mind. And so we put together an ocean climate action plan. What are the actions in the ocean that could actually help us achieve our climate emission reduction and adaptation goals? I think this was the first country to ever do an ocean climate action plan. Other countries have seen it and said, whoa, that looks interesting. Maybe we should do the same too. So there's a benefit in sharing and talking. That ocean climate action plan focuses on offshore wind, it focuses on green shipping, and it focuses on blue carbon. So the coastal ecosystems like seagrass beds, mangroves, salt marshes, and also open ocean that are absorbing carbon. That's what that is embedded in the Ocean Climate Action Plan. That plan also identifies carbon dioxide removal from the ocean as potentially important, but for which we have insufficient information to do it right now. And so we have, hopefully to be released in the not too distant future, is an identification of research priorities for marine carbon dioxide removal so that we can get on with the business of getting the knowledge we need to know whether we can do it effectively and safely. We also put together an ocean justice strategy that is embedded in a lot of the Ocean Climate Action Plan, and a separate effort on identifying how can we get better information, data, and research about all these policies and how they affect environmental justice. So this portfolio of things is really focused on land and ocean-based solutions. Finally, within this climate policy bucket that I'm focusing on is how we talk about this and how we share what we're doing. You all are familiar with IPCC, the International Scientific Assessment about climate change. In the US, we have a national climate assessment. We released our 5th one last year. We do it every 4-ish years. And this last one was really quite distinctly different from others in that it not only talked about impacts, but it also talked about solutions and what communities are doing. And it was much more hopeful instead of just all this bad stuff happening. You could also see in the report all the things that communities in every community across the US, every state in the US, citizens are taking action to address climate change in one way or another. And seeing all that was extremely powerful and gives communities ideas from each other, but it also says, we're not starting from scratch here. There's a lot that's underway. Are we where we need to be? Not at all. But here's some ideas and here's action, and that is very encouraging. We also spend a lot of time providing better climate services. And so part of which is data, products, information about climate that are scale relevant to decisions and that are I was going to say non-technical. That's not correct. It's plain language, easy to understand and use, and you don't have to be super technically trained to be able to understand what the services are saying. So the National Climate Assessment, for the first time ever, included an interactive climate atlas, for example, which you can go to it, you can identify a city, for example, and downscale all of the climate data as it is relevant to your community. So that downscaling is actually pretty powerful and hasn't been available prior to this. So that climate atlas that's associated with the National Climate Assessment is pretty cool. So to put this sort of in a different context, what we have done with our climate policies is to acknowledge that this left-hand column are the way most climate policies focus, or where they focus: on mitigation, on emission reduction, on technology, land, just providing the science and estimating greenhouse gases. What we have done is also say we also need this column. We need adaptation, not just mitigation. We need carbon removal, not just emission reduction. Nature, ocean. There is no path to our climate goals without the ocean. So the ocean is key here. Services, in addition to science and measuring emissions, actually measuring them, not just estimating what is likely to be there. And I've given you examples in each of those as they relate specifically to our EJ and nature embedding in this climate. So I think you can see from this, we've tried to do this integration within the context of very ambitious, bold climate policies. So what about EJ and climate in nature? Well, the starting point for this is to reframe how we think about loss of biodiversity in nature, because it's usually thought of, the go-to is always protected areas. For the whole biodiversity community, protected areas for decades has been the primary focus. Despite what the IPBES reports say about all the drivers, people still focus on the protected areas. And with the new Kunming-Montreal Protocol target of protecting 30% of the lands and the seas by 2030, that's the focus of the biodiversity COP16, that's underway right now in Colombia. And also, in addition to focusing on protected areas, we have been trying to address the drivers of loss of biodiversity in not just the other 70%, but the 100%. So protected areas are necessary, but not sufficient. And we'll never reach our climate goals if we don't also address what's happening in the other 70%. So we're taking a 100% approach to our biodiversity, not just a 30% approach. And we're doing that by connecting the dots between nature and climate, nature and equity, nature and economy, nature and national security, nature and health. And a lot of people don't know those connections. And so that's part of what we've been trying to do. So one way we're doing that, for example, is to create natural capital accounts, put nature on the economic balance sheet of the country. We are embedding nature in our national security strategy. For the first time ever, our national security strategy talks about natural security. Our national security strategy talks about natural security, understanding that loss of biodiversity is as much of a threat to national security as is climate change. And so there's a whole portfolio of activities that are helping to educate the defense, intelligence, and security communities about both climate change and loss of biodiversity. We're creating our first ever national security. Agnette is giving me a, oops, my timer's off. Okay, thank you. A national nature assessment to take stock of the changes that are happening, what's likely in the future, what the options are. And we are doing benefit cost analyses, which I've already mentioned to you, that now include ecosystem services. So that's part of the portfolio of aligning biodiversity and nature policy with knowledge. These are the things that I just mentioned. And we are embedding climate and nature into EJ policies. And each of those are things that I've already mentioned in the context of one of the other things. So you can see full circle how it's all coming together. So what we see here then is historically ambitious, not just climate policy, but integration of these three major topics. It's integrated, it's holistic, and it is not only in the things I've talked about, but in other elements of our national security and our economic policies. Part of what we've been able to do is mobilize resources, provide some mandates, thou shalt, but even more powerfully, incentives to encourage behavior that is going to lead to the outcomes that are desirable. All of that is beginning to deliver benefits across all three of those. And again, this is just a down payment on what's needed. It's not enough. And we shouldn't pretend that it is enough. And so John Podesta, the president's lead climate person, always talks about all of this very ambitious action as a down payment on what is needed. This is getting us closer to, I think, tipping points where there is more social support for more. So if you do a down payment, you have to do more, right? So to get more, you have to demonstrate that it's useful. So we have these intertwined global challenges. I've tried to describe a little bit about how we are thinking about sort of the framework that puts these together, but some of the specific policies and different policy levers that are enabling us to achieve this integration. And I would leave you with the thought that creating and implementing this holistic strategy is not just something that we have seen as being useful and important, but something that needs to be done much more broadly, not only across the federal government, but in states and communities, in other countries around the world. And we need to translate our scientific knowledge into action, but doing that really requires greater engagement of scientists in this process. Scientists in government, scientists outside of government that are working with policymakers, working with scientists in government to help do that integration. And for that to work, scientists have to move beyond the doom and gloom, the, oh, isn't this bad, scaring people to death, because that's not enough. And in fact, sometimes it turns people off. And what we need is, yes, this is serious. Yes, these problems are huge. And yes, they're getting worse. We need solutions. And here are some solutions that we know are working. Here are some opportunities to have win-win solutions with co-benefits that create jobs, that address inequity and biodiversity loss and climate change. So that integration is actually helpful from a social standpoint, but it's also what's needed to achieve the end goals. You all know how urgent the situation is. Many of you study many of these problems, and we know full well that the clock is ticking. There's not a lot of time. And so in addition to understanding the Earth system and understanding how it's changing and why it's changing, We need to translate that knowledge into not only awareness, but policy and action. So I invite you to join me in doing just that. Thank you. Good. Thank you.
As I promised, quite unique experience for us to hear and to really
Be challenged.
Amazing. Started to transform big country in policies and make it stick, as you said. So you didn't mention so much about that, but perhaps I could ask you a little bit about how you see that this can continue, even given the turbulence you have now in US politics.
Thank you. Really important. We have been so when I served in government before, when I was the head of NOAA from 2009 to 2013, a lot of the policies that the Obama administration implemented were my time's up. A lot of the policies that were implemented during the Obama administration, the first thing that Mr. Trump did when he became president was to undo as much as he could. And that is obviously not a good way for governments to behave, but it also provided a lot of important lessons. And I went back and I looked at, of the policies that I was directly involved in at NOAA, which ones were in fact undone and which ones weren't. And one of the major ones I talked about a couple of days ago with some of you, and that was major reforms of our fisheries. And those policies were extraordinarily difficult to achieve because it was a new way of managing fisheries. And fishermen, for the most part, there were a few visionary fishermen that worked with us, but for the most part, the rank and file were no way, go away, this is awful, it's terrible, because it was the devil that they knew versus the devil they didn't know, and they were really worried about a different situation, thinking it might be actually worse. As it turns out, those policies benefited fishermen directly and immediately, and were so beneficial that when the next administration came in and started undoing things, the fishermen said, don't touch this. Don't touch this. This is working for us. Don't mess with the good thing. And so the importance of having constituents see benefit from a new policy is critically important. So we folded that information into what we are doing with in the Biden administration, thinking about how do we make our policies sticky, in the language of social scientists. Very technical term, sticky. But doing that means a lot of different things. Many of these policies were initiated at the White House or empowered by the White House if they were initiated by an agency, for example. But we have tried to have the agencies now be completely the owners of this, so that the continuation of a policy is not driven by who's in the White House. That is, there's ownership in the agencies, there are budgets in the agencies, there are champions that are really excited about this work. Does that guarantee that it won't be undone? No, but it is more likely that it won't be. And oftentimes what happens in agencies is that things might not be, people might not be talking about it, but they're still doing the work. And so that's one way of making it sticky, having people outside the government know about the work and how it's benefiting constituents across the political spectrum is critically important. So those are some of the elements of how we are thinking about making it sticky. Having lots of ownership, especially bipartisan ownership, especially with members of Congress on the Hill, This is a very challenging time to be doing that. And the election is so scary because things are so close and there's so much on the line. So I think we've done everything that we can to make a lot of these things sticky. I'm hopeful that we'll have a good outcome in November, but of course, we won't know until then or whenever the final word comes. So, next question.
Now let's open up for the audience. And Wendy, you had a question, and then Daniel.
Hi, Wendy Broadgate at Future Earth. Thank you, Jane, for the most very comprehensive and very practical talk directed at us scientists. It's really appreciated. You touched on the importance of the different levels of governance and the different levels of influencing, from local and regional authorities through to national government. Can you say a little bit about the intergovernmental processes and how they can be of benefit or not to advancing national policies, and particularly in relation to science influence on those intergovernmental processes like the COP in Colombia right now and the upcoming climate COP?
I think, great question, Wendy, thank you. Obviously, we need action at all those different levels. And by citizens, as well as governments, as well as the private sector, civil society, everybody, has a key role to play here. I didn't talk about a lot of the things that we are doing with states and with local communities, but it's obviously critically important. I can tell you that I had an opportunity to participate, actually help co-organize a summit that the Pope convened at the Vatican a number of months ago, entitled From Climate Crisis to Climate Resilience. And he strategically invited sub-national leaders, so governors and mayors from around the world. And they came and talked about what they were doing. And it was so inspiring because they're doing so much and it's so cool. And it's not what you hear about most of the time. And so a lot of that action is at the local level, at the state level, and is critically important. In terms of the intergovernmental level from country to country and the national intergovernmental bodies and entities, that's critically important too. And I think a lot of the same elements apply. A lot of the conventions have a substa, for example, that is expected to be producing the science and teeing up policy relevant, the science policies that are based in science for the Conference of the Parties, for example. So we have mechanisms to get science into some of those policies. And of course, politics plays a good role too. But a lot of the same things that I've talked about are transferable to those different scales, whether it's the international or down to the local. It's still about relationships between scientists and individual politicians or policymakers. It's about having information that is relevant to the decisions that are there. It's about understanding the policy levers that are available and how to use them. It's about building constituents. The name of the game, if you want to get something done internationally, is to get a whole bunch of countries to say, yeah, we're on board. And so doing that, Future Earth has a huge opportunity because you play in this space. And so I'd love to hear from you. And in fact, from all of you, I've talked about what we are doing, but many of you are also involved in, connecting science to policy. And what experiences you have, and collectively, if we have some lessons learned, I think would be very valuable. So I'm sure back at you, you can share with us some of the things that you've seen work.
Great, thanks. And Daniel, and then there's a gentleman up here.
Thank you very much, Daniel Ospina from Future Earth. So I have a question about what is the science that is communicated? So, and what I mean is there is a tension between scientific consensus, and as you said, like new science, new discoveries, emergent science. You mentioned also the role of boundary organizations and intermediaries. So they are having that important task of choosing and translating that science, and it's a huge responsibility. How do you think one can navigate communicating to policymakers things that are completely established, that can be said to be by scientists, as opposed to things that might be new and very present, but are by one group of scientists and maybe not fully endorsed by the whole scientific community?
Thanks, Danny. That is a really important focus or topic. And the temptation for a lot of scientists is to want to share their latest breakthroughs and make it seem like, okay, problem solved, or hey, I've got the last word. And while that might play within the scientific world, it's not always that helpful in the policy and public communication world unless it is put in the context of does this align with what we know? Is it completely different? Why is it different? So putting it in context, I think, is really important. And that burden, unfortunately, is on scientists, because most journalists, with the exception of a few who are very sophisticated, or most policymakers, aren't going to have that context and won't really know. And so having a sense of how this fits and whether we think it is, that's why the international scientific assessments are so helpful. The problem is when they come out only every X years, they're almost immediately out of date because they have to have a cutoff date for including scientific information. And so it's a challenge. I mean, that is still sort of the Bible, but there is new stuff beyond that we need to be sharing, especially in systems that are changing as fast as they are today. So it's a tension, and that's where groups of scientists, I think, can be helpful as opposed to individual scientists in communicating. And credible institutions are really powerful here. And so for Future Earth to say something should count for a lot. For the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences to say something should count for a lot. So in scientific institutions that are politically and communication savvy have a key role to play in all of this.
Wonderful. There's a gentleman up here.
Hi, I represent a private investor. And I was heartened by the fact that you mentioned resilience so many times. And I had the fortune of meeting Professor Rockström the other day, and he pointed out that agriculture and the food production industry is by far the worst pollutant, or the biggest danger to the planetary boundaries that he's been spending time on. And you also mentioned fisheries as a part that you have been active in. And you did mention resistance and adaptation. So this is a complicated question. What have you done, or what do you plan to do in terms of agriculture and the food production industry in the United States in terms of transformative actions, and which could also lead to the social tipping points that you talked about? Because better agriculture, better food would mean better well-being for people, and voila, you may have the social tipping point.
Great question. There's no doubt but that food systems, both on land and in the ocean, are critically important to solving this challenge. They do contribute, agriculture does contribute a very significant amount of greenhouse gases. And for the most part, they are either not or less regulated in terms of emissions than many other industries where it's a lot easier because you have a point source, for example. In the United States, part of our, so I mentioned, but I didn't go into very much, what we are doing to actually measure greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to estimate them. Most countries that are calculating their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, as part of their Paris commitments, are doing so by estimating what they think their emissions are based on how many farms there are, how many cars there are on the road, how many factories there are, and using estimates that we know are imperfect, but you don't know exactly where they're imperfect. And we know that for farms, for example, the amount of carbon that is stored in soils or the amount of emissions that come from agricultural activities varies hugely. And so the name of the game now is going to be actually measuring, not just estimating. And that gives us better information to know where we're doing well and where we need to do a lot better, which policies are working. And so I think there will be increasing interest on the part of many countries to actually measure those emissions. And that's done by a combination of satellites. And in our case, we're using some planes to measure through part of the atmosphere that satellites don't, that's closer to the ground, where satellites don't have the kind of information that you want at the same scale, as well as on the ground measurements. So some of those might be towers, some of them might be actual samplers in fields. So, and what we are doing with our measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verification effort, MMRV, for greenhouse gases, is to figure out how to do that integration across those different platforms and how to harmonize those measurements with the actual estimates, how to have those talk to one another so we can do a better job. So part of the game here, I think, is having better information so that we can be more accountable in terms of policies that would help reduce emissions from agriculture, for example. From ag, it's not only carbon dioxide, but there are other emissions that are really important. Ammonia, for example, is really important. And so it depends on what kind of agriculture it is and what the relevant greenhouse gases might be. So that's an area where I think good science is really needed, and it's an active area in a lot of universities to help generate the kind of information that would help us know how to feed the future without wrecking the planet, essentially. And some of that involves recognizing that diets matter hugely, and having information that people can use to make choices about how much animal protein they eat, for example, versus plant protein. And dietary choices are huge. The whole Eat Lancet activities have really brought that to light in a very, very helpful way. So I think this is a very active area that needs even more attention.
Thank you, Jane. We have two more questions before we have to stop. Only one. We have one from the
Online.
Online,
line,
yes.
and Uno's going to have a short one also.
Okay, I'll try to make short answers.
Okay.
So one from the is about the whole idea of, or the whole reality of extreme events and shocks, and how you consider that the whole concept of polycrisis is that coming into some of the guiding parts here, or how do you look at that now, and all the storms you have had and the droughts and all of that?
So we are seeing more and more extreme events around the world. That's certainly true in the US, but it's absolutely true globally. And that provides, should provide a wake-up call to a lot of people that this is serious. This is not something that's down the road. It's here now. It's actually affecting lives and property, livelihoods. And the effects are even probably more damaging than we appreciate. And so I think that is both stronger motivation to reduce emissions, but also underscores the importance of adaptation and of getting prepared and being prepared. We're going to see more heat waves. We're going to see more intense hurricanes. We're going to see more droughts. We're going to see more extreme heat events on land and in the ocean. And we need to be more prepared for those. And so for our fisheries, how do you make fisheries climate ready? For agriculture, how do you make agriculture climate ready in light of these shocks and in ways that don't further exacerbate the problem? So those are big challenges, and we are actively working on them, and will continue to do so.
Fantastic to hear that you will continue to do so, because I think we have to break here now because it's a bit over 12. And you know, please, those who would like to have some questions for Jane, do it right after here now. And there's a lot of questions on the internet actually.
Sorry, we didn't get to them all.
Didn't have time for. So fantastic. What a moment in life to be part of, and to get some injection of hope, for not just sort of dreaming hope, but the real world action hope. Thanks a lot, Jane.
Thank you all.